Good morning and welcome to everyone on this Thursday morning. I'm delighted to introduce this morning's session on this fourth day of the 2020 Association of Academic Health Centers research meeting, a presentation and discussion on strategies for increasing racial diversity of the scientific workforce. As the Associate Vice President of Inclusive Excellence and Health Equity and Vice Dean for Inclusion and Diversity at UT Health San Antonio, and the Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long School of Medicine, and Chair-elect of the Association of American Medical Colleges Group on Diversity and Inclusion, this topic is critical importance to the work that I do. Diversifying a health science center requires more than recruitment or numerical diversity. We're very much engaged in all aspects ranging from curriculum, policy, practice, outreach, and training, pipeline programs, just to name a few, and efforts to create an inclusive and equitable learning and work environment. I'm excited to serve as the moderator today. As a friendly reminder, we ask that you use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen to pose a question. It gives me great honor to introduce to you Dr. Marie Bernard, Acting Director of the Scientific Workforce Diversity Office, Deputy Director, National Institute on Aging at the NIH. Dr. Bernard.
Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to get an opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to begin sharing my slides. Let's come back to the beginning. Okay, as was stated, I have the honor of serving as acting NIH Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity, attempting to fill some very big shoes vacated by Dr. Hannah Valentine when she left NIH at the end of September to return to Stanford to lead efforts there. But there's great momentum that has been developed as a result of her efforts, and some interesting, fun things that are brewing here at NIH. I would say tune in to the advisory committee to the director meeting that's taking place a week from tomorrow to hear more about that. But right now, I will talk to you in my role as the acting chief officer. I'll intersperse a bit because I've been the deputy director of the National Institute on Aging for the last 11 years, and will not be able to avoid talking a little bit about that. My goal over the course of the next 20 to 25 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, will be to address 5 questions. Why does diversity and inclusion matter? What's the current diversity of the scientific workforce? What's the likely impact of COVID-19 on that diversity? What are some best practices for promoting inclusive excellence? And the big question, what about the R01 funding gap for underrepresented groups that actually led to the development of this role of the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity? So, why does diversity and inclusion matter? I am going to talk at a very high level about that. I'm presuming that I'm preaching to the choir here, but there's quite a bit of research, generally qualitative, some quantitative, that shows, particularly in the business literature, that diversity leads to better outcomes. An example is the report by Hong and Page, now pretty dated from 2004, that developed hypothetical scenarios for solving problems, and had individuals who scored anything from 60 to 100% individually on solving those scenarios, and then put forward the hypothetical of comparing an individual solving the problem versus a group, the top 10, the top 20, top 40, or randomly assigned individuals. And what was found in this hypothetical that they put forward is that the 20 randomly selected applicants, who all were qualified but were not necessarily at the top 20 or 40, were actually better at solving the problem than the highest scored individuals, supporting the concept that having a diverse group could make a difference and lead to better outcomes. More proximate to your role as leaders in academic health centers is this report by Freeman Long from 2015 that looked at impact factors of articles published in the scientific literature. And what they attempted to do here was to see whether the ethnicity of the authors as determined by surnames that were Hispanic or Asian or not. And they gave it an index in terms of how homogeneous the group appeared to be, was associated with impact factor. And they found that the more authors and the less homogeneity there was in the group, the higher the impact factor, suggesting that the group interaction led to better outcomes. Of course, there are lots of other reasons why a group of researchers could lead to a higher impact factor for a published article than just a two-authored paper, but some soft data pointing in that direction. We at NIH are sufficiently impressed with the qualitative information and with the quantitative information as it exists that there is importance in capitalizing on the opportunity of diversity. It allows us to take advantage of excellence and creativity and innovation. It allows us to broaden the scope of inquiry. It's, as I will show you later, very striking that scientists who come from underrepresented backgrounds have a tendency to look at topics of inquiry related to health disparities, et cetera, that perhaps would not otherwise be probed. Given the changing demographics of our country, it's important to take advantage of this as well. And in order to maintain our global research preeminence. So we really value this, as you will see in some subsequent things I'll be presenting. So what about this question about the current diversity of the scientific workforce? Again, very high level. I'm presuming you are very familiar with these data. We have found, as you well know, that there's diminishing representation of women and underrepresented scientists as you go from people who have an associate's degree all the way up to people who are at the level of a department chair. I'm going to see if I can get my pointer to work. And I may turn off the phone here, sorry. The trials and tribulations of working from home. As you can see, when you look at people at the level of an associate's degree, you have significant percentages of underrepresented women shown in yellow, of well-represented women shown in green, of underrepresented men shown in light blue, of well-represented men in dark blue. In fact, if anyone's underrepresented in this population, it may be men, particularly underrepresented men. But as you go from people with associate's degrees in the sciences to bachelor's to master's to doctoral degrees, then on into academia, instructor, assistant professor, associate professor, and full and department chair, the data are very skewed and not representative of certainly what you see earlier in the pipeline. And we all know that there are lots of reasons that these things change, particularly for women. Some of the challenges in having dual roles of being a professional scientist, academic, and dealing with childcare and caregiving responsibilities for people from underrepresented groups, sometimes financial pressures for both groups, potentially issues with regards to sufficient role modeling and mentoring, lots of different things that have been identified as contributing to this poor pipeline. It's something that we all need to think about addressing. And we at NIH have been very concerned about the likely impact of COVID-19 on this. And I understand from looking at your agenda that you have had some discussions about this. Being a data-driven organization, we of course did a survey of our staff to get a sense of the impact of COVID. Our survey was conducted the last 2 weeks of July and went out to all of our employees. We had a wonderful 51.2% response, about 17,000 individuals. And we have actually posted the results of our survey on a publicly accessible website if you want to take a look. The goal was to understand the impact of COVID-19 on our workforce in general, but very specifically to identify groups that might be newly vulnerable, the impact on underrepresented groups who, for all the reasons that the scientific workforce pipeline is drippy, leaky, would likely be particularly impacted by the pandemic, and to help us to think about interventions to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. And we're very much in the midst of looking at that sort of issue. What we found for our staff, and I would posit that there may be similar data that will be coming from the extramural survey that hopefully many of you participated in, is that caretaking is common. Almost half of the people surveyed had caretaking responsibilities, and 1 in 5 indicated that caretaking made their work substantially more difficult. This is particularly an issue for people responsible for young children. It was particularly an impact on the people who are intramural researchers, in other words, our bench researchers, as opposed to our extramural staff who generally are at the desk and having administrative responsibilities. We also found that, as expected, COVID had an impact on job productivity, particularly negative impact on trainees, not surprisingly. Almost half of those people who did bench research perceiving it as negatively impacting them. But very interestingly, only 8.7% of people who had desk type jobs, the extramural researchers, feeling that they were impacted. And in fact, almost 40% of our population felt that their productivity was higher than normal under the pandemic circumstances. Again, this is late July, whether that's changed now that the working from home has been very prolonged, we're beginning to inquire about. But as we further looked at the data, it appeared that particularly people from underrepresented backgrounds who were not bench researchers felt that their productivity was even higher than their colleagues not of that background, leading to lots of questions. You know, are there things that are ameliorated by working from home or working at a distance that they were experiencing on the work site that impacted their productivity? There's been a lot of discussion in the literature about microaggressions, et cetera. Whether we can pull that out of the data is not clear, but it certainly leads to reasons for speculation. We also found that, again, this is late July, over half of the staff were uncomfortable with returning to on-site, with a lot of appropriate concerns: acquiring COVID, transmitting it, being able to maintain physical distancing, and the proportions were much higher in underrepresented groups like African Americans and Hispanics, appropriately so. Those are populations that have been very adversely impacted by the pandemic. We suspect, again, that the extramural survey may show similar things. And then to talk about the extramural survey, hopefully many of you were invited to participate. We fielded 2 surveys from October through November. One was to look at the impact of COVID-19 on institutions. So it went to an institutional leader like a vice president for research or an equivalent. We focused on the top NIH funded institutions, and I think it was about 1,000 total, enriched with minority serving institutions. And we got, I guess it wasn't quite 1,000, because we got about 200 research leaders to respond with a 34% response rate. And we're beginning to look at those data. Additionally, the week after that was fielded, we fielded a survey of individual researchers, and these were individuals who utilized ERA Commons in the prior 2 years. So they had either gotten an award, or they'd applied for an award, or they were associated with one of those 2 types of activities. And we got, with a lot of urging, a 20% response rate, approximately 45,000 researchers. We recognized early on that one of the things that was a barrier is that the emails came from an outside vendor called Qualtrics, and a lot of people, appropriately, were reluctant to open those emails because they didn't recognize it. As soon as we started having emails coming from NIH, and in particular had Mike Lauer, the director of our Office of Extramural Research, to blog about it and write things, that we got a much better response rate. So the institutional survey ended November 6th. The extramural survey ended November 13th. We're beginning to look at the data at very, very top level. No surprises, very akin to the sorts of things that we have found with our own NIH survey. Over the course of the next couple of months, we will be doing further and cleaning the data, some very refined analyses, This came out of the office of the Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity, because our first question is, how is this impacting these underrepresented groups? But in order to know that, you need to know how are things impacting the scientific community as a whole. And we expect that the data will help to guide policies and procedures for NIH going forward. So, what are some best practices to promote inclusive excellence? I'm very impressed by the data that shows that there are issues with regards to self-perception, in terms of how others perceive an individual that influence diversity of the workforce. This study by Banchevsky and colleagues is an example of that. What they did in their experiment was to provide pictures of actual faculty members in STEM from elite universities, and they asked a group of students to rate the faculty in terms of the degree of masculinity and femininity. So this is more feminine, this is more masculine for men and women. They then asked a separate group of students to rate the pictures for the likelihood that an individual was a scientist. And what was found is that for the females, those who had increased femininity had a decreased perception of being a scientist and an increased perception of being a childhood educator. Just speaking to lots of other studies and literature that suggests that we have a tendency as humans to have a way of perceiving things that influences how we make judgments. I apologize to the neuroscientists in the audience. I'm a humble general internist. The way I think of it is that you have baked in ways of looking at things that makes it more efficient to make decisions. And there is a baked in perception of who is a scientist that can influence the way that we subtly make decisions about who's going to be selected for what position, can influence those individuals themselves about whether they really fit in an environment. And that's something that the literature would suggest can be modified. One can change that way of thinking by simply raising awareness, by broadening images of success, by having consistency in judgment and evaluation criteria when making selections of faculty, and avoiding ambiguity and time pressure. Particularly if there's a time pressure, there's a tendency to revert back to the built-in ways of thinking about things rather than thinking more broadly, and encouraging individuals to speak up when they see evidence that people thinking in a stereotypical fashion rather than objectively looking at criteria that have been put forward for a selection. It certainly appears that interventions at the individual level can make a difference, but it's necessary but not sufficient, and that there are interventions that are needed at an institutional level as well. And we at NIH, again, have been implementing programs in keeping with that tenet. For instance, in order to promote or bring about institutional transformation and culture change, there needs to be transparency and accountability. Things like systematically reviewing and being transparent about hiring and promotion procedures and policies, collecting and publicly aggregating diversity metrics, providing tools for enhancing recruitment and retention and evaluating the impact of that. All of those, and having it all linked to institutional values and reward systems. So are we doing that? Yes, we are. Hannah very smartly put into place a toolkit that allows anyone to go about thinking about a more diverse group of candidates to consider for a position. I refer you to diversity.nih.gov toolkit that tells you step by step what we have been doing here at NIH. For every new search for a tenure track investigator in our intramural program, number one, the Scientific Workforce Diversity Office is there to talk about the tendency to think in a stereotypical fashion and potentially provide some training to mediate that. And then to provide to the search committee a curated list of scientists who, when you go into the literature, you find that they've highly published in that same subject area. You do some additional analyses to make sure you have a good diverse group and provide that list of scientists to the search committee for consideration. And it's gotten to be such a valued exercise at NIH that I will say in these 2 months as the acting COSWID, it's been really tough keeping up because it seems like every day they're looking for a new list of individuals to help with the search. So it's really encouraging. People look for it, they expect it, they make the outreach. We also have what's called an NIH Equity Committee. This was established a couple of years ago to do the metrics for diversity in the intramural research program. As you know, we have 27 institutes and centers at NIH. I like to think of it as being on an academic health campus on steroids, because every one of them is like a school within that campus. The institute director, you might say, is the provost or the dean, and you have the others who report. And so the scientific directors of each of these, maybe senior associate deans, are expected to come to this committee and report. It ends up being every other year because you can't get all 27 or so in a 12-month period of time with monthly meetings. And they're expected to report on demographics, salaries, and resources provided to their tenured and tenure track investigators to be assured that these individuals are being treated equitably. They additionally are expected to provide information on the composition of the members of the Board of Scientific Counselors and ad hoc reviewers. This is the group that reviews the work of the tenured and tenure track investigators every 5 years to make sure, every 4 years, to make sure that they are on track, make recommendations as to whether they should get continued resources. And if there are inequities that are perceived, they're expected to correct those inequities. Additionally, they're expected to report on the diversity of speakers at seminars hosted by the Institute or Center, speaking to this issue of role models for diverse groups. They're expected to promote awareness of stereotypical thinking, and that's assisted by the Scientific Workforce Diversity Office and the trainings that are available. They're expected to report on their best practices for search committees and outreach. Again, very much facilitated by the Scientific Workforce Diversity Office, providing lists of diverse candidates for consideration. They even are asked to report on who they've put forward for various awards, and the diversity of that grouping is considered. You may have heard a year or so back that NIH was also putting in term limits for lab chiefs, the equivalent department chairs. That did not come to fruition. There were some legal barriers to doing so. But instead, what's in place is a routine review of the lab chief with regards to their leadership and mentoring. But prior to this time, that yes, they were reviewed every 4 years, but it was really a focus on their scientific accomplishments. Now, their scientific accomplishments are considered, and separately their leadership and mentoring is considered. And it's expected that they will be excellent or more in the area of leadership and mentoring. And if not, that there will be a remediation plan put in place. And if that's not successful, they would potentially be removed as a lab chief, to try to, again, focus on making sure that there is support and outreach to a variety of scientists, and that they are brought along in the system as they ought to be. Additionally, we have a program called the Distinguished Scholars Program that has been very successful in enhancing the diversity of the intramural research program. It's built upon 2 programs that have been around for about a decade, the Statman and Lasker programs that were also meant for diversity. They are basically hiring of groups of individuals who come to NIH saying, I have this expertise and I'm interested in this. And then there's a match made between the best of those individuals and the institutes and centers. What's been built upon that is as those people are applying, they're they're given the opportunity to apply for the Distinguished Scholars Program, where they indicate what their interest is and their track record is in enhancing diversity. And the best of those individuals get selected to get additional resources, to meet on a monthly basis, to become a network of individuals who support each other, who get to meet with other senior researchers, get advice on how to get started with their lab and things of that sort. It's basically a self-reinforcing community of individuals who are interested in diversity and inclusion. And as you can see from the pictures of the 2018 and 2019 cohorts, it's a diverse group. The 2020 cohort, of course, was launched by Zoom, and I don't have that Zoom picture. This shows you what has happened as a result of it. The Statman and Lasker program starting in about 2010 with an increase in diversity, and the Diversity Scholars Program with a marked increase in diversity, which has been very promising. So much so that NIH is also now soon, funding opportunity announcement has yet to be published, but should be any day now. We've committed to something called the Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustained Transformation Program, the FIRST program. And it's basically to replicate what we've been doing, particularly with the Distinguished Scholars Program. The overarching goal is to create cultures of inclusive excellence. The program objectives are we will fund 10 academic entities and to have cohorts of faculty who are hired for multi-level mentoring and professional development. We'll expect these grantees will have integrated institution-wide systems to address bias, faculty equity, mentoring, and work-life issues. There'll be an additional grant. There's a separate FOA for a coordinating center for independent program evaluation. Hopefully we'll find some generalized principles that can be disseminated. And there's a considerable commitment, a goal of expectation of almost $250 million over the next 9 years. This was announced back in July with a notice of intent to publish. And as I said, any day now, they've been telling me that ever since I came into this job, October 1, but any day now, it will be published. So what about this big, almost elephant in the room about the R01 funding gap for underrepresented groups? As I said, this is what led to the establishment of the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity role at COSWID. Ginter's study in Science of 2011 found that when investigators were evaluated based upon race and ethnicity, initially people of an Asian background, Hispanic background, or African American or Black were at a disadvantage in getting R01 equivalent grants as compared to non-Hispanic whites. However, after controlling for education, country of origin, training, previous research record, publications, employer characteristics, just about everything they could think of, it was found that there was only a persistent gap for Black applicants. Black applicants remained 10 percentage points less likely than whites to be awarded NIH funding. And this was what led to the advisory committee to the director developing a diversity working group. The diversity working group bringing forth suggestions that got endorsed by the advisory committee for NIH to do a number of things, including establishing a chief officer for scientific workforce diversity. This problem continues to plague us. In 2019, Pomp and colleagues reported that they found, yes, still a persistent funding gap. And they felt that it was due to 3 factors: a preference by African Americans and Blacks for some topics over others, those topics being assigned poorer scores or often not being discussed at all. So they felt that it was all revolved around decisions made by reviewers. However, hopefully you've seen Mike Lauer, director of our Office of Extramural Research, in August in his blog published a new analysis that pointed out that our institutes and centers have widely varying award rates. The National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities has the worst. The National Eye Institute has the best. As I said, I'm from the Aging Institute. we're not very high up there. And what was found is that 35% of applications from African American and Black applicants went to 6 institutes and centers, and 5 of those 6 had less than the average funding award rate, R1 reward rate for NIH. They tended to focus on certain topics, but those lower award rates were similar at those institutes and centers in terms of discussion rates, mean and median priority scores, and percentile rankings. So it really appeared that the differential award rates were related to a greater proportion of the topics that these researchers were looking at going disproportionately to these institutes and centers that had lower success rates. And this is pointed out for us a new potential target for intervention, and there's a lot of vigorous discussion about that as well. Another bit of information along these lines, however, is this wonderful new report from Weber Main and colleagues about the National Research Mentoring Network Grant Writing and Coaching Program. The National Research Mentoring Network and the BUILD programs were other outcomes from recommendations from the Diversity Working Group of the Advisory Committee to the Director. And this national network has developed grant writing and coaching programs. They've been able to train some 545 investigators. They've had 93 of them to go on to get NIH awards, 134 to get NIH and non-NIH awards. And they've been distributed nicely among R01s and larger grants, other R series and training grants, which has been really edifying and a demonstration that there are things that can be done to make some differences. Excuse me. Excuse me. So I will close by saying that we believe that a diversity of backgrounds and viewpoints of faculty can lead to better outcomes in the science. There's certainly a lot of qualitative and quantitative things in the business setting, and more literature developing in the science setting to support this. I hope that we all agree that diversity in academia is subpar, and that's something that we need to look at trying to address. We're very concerned that underrepresented faculty may be at risk as a result of the COVID pandemic. That they're disproportionately in those early stages, and as we could see, the early stages, those tend to be people who have young children. Those tend to be people who don't have the really well-defined and well set up mentoring and resources to help things to move forward. So that's a great concern. And I hope that I've convinced you that there are some evidence-based and accessible approaches to enhancing faculty diversity, and in particular, once the FOA is out, a real opportunity to compete for NIH funds to help promote that. So I will close with this adage from the Scientific Workforce Diversity Office that great minds think differently, and I will be very interested in your comments.